I'm Dave.
And I'm Andrew, and we are the IB English guys. And today we are going to talk about poetry, and we believe this is an excellent video for both IB literature students as well as IB Langlet students. Regardless of the course you're taking, we're all studying poetry. So for today's video, a short preview. We're going to read a poem together. We will then discuss some first impressions. We're going to apply an acronym we discussed in an earlier video called SPEC films. And lastly, we're going to end by showing you some annotations and hopefully help you improve your approach in annotating poetry.
That's right. Good preview, Mr. Cohen. If you haven't seen our previous video, How to Read a Poem, make sure you check that out because we talk about this acronym in great detail and deconstruct a great Maya Angelou poem. So be sure to watch that. The SPEC Films acronym, I think, is a great way for us to just enter into a poem and ask some questions about it. And spec is the beginning part of the poem. We want to think about S stands for speaker and subject of the poem. The P is the purpose and that theme that the poem is all that the poem involves. And E is emotion. We want to think almost about emotions. What are the different, what's the different tone shifts and where do we see, what kind of emotional words that we want to talk about?
Yeah, the C stands for authorial craft, right? Those choices the author is making. And we can subdivide that into the smaller word films. And in this case, the F stands for figurative language. The I is more specific in looking at different types of imagery. The L looks at language, possibly a different connotation and denotation of words. The M is musicality, sort of how does the poem sound? And then the S, of course, is the structure, because structure can really give you some insight into the meaning of a poem.
Yeah, great. We've chosen a poem today that I really love, that we really love, and it's a poem from New Zealand. And the poet's name is Bob Orr. You can see the link to this poem at the bottom, and definitely want to take a look at that. But the first thing we want to do is just read this poem. This was used for an IB assessment in the past, and we think it makes a great poem to tackle. It's called The Tire Shop. So follow with me as I read this poem. It begins every morning. I'm sitting at my desk trying to tap into inspiration, but really, I'm just waiting for the tire shop man to show up. When he rolls a cigarette, I might just roll one too. I notice, like me, that before anything else, he drinks coffee. We're neighbors, I guess you could say. When he winds up the roller doors, it's like the first act of a play. On the pavement, on each side of him, the tires are stacked up like black donuts. But when they spin in the wheel alignment machine, they become dark rings of invisible planets. Does he know how intrigued I become with these mysteries? The tire shop man, bear-like in blue overalls, lumbers about in front of the tire shop's cavernous dark. One day, I'll tell him that I too have struggled to get words to align, to work out their balance, their weight, the true measure of their rhyme. But later, as I watch the sun subsides through the gum trees in the park at the back of my flat, all of a sudden so big that not even they can keep it held up, a wild orb of redness tearing itself apart, ripped from its axle, breaking open the branches. A little while later, like a wheel cut from crystal, the moon will lift out over the great emptiness and silence of Eden Park's huge stadiums. The other poem may or may not ever be written, but this is the one for the tire shop man. Oh, stranger and neighbor, my accomplice, my mentor, and my muse.
Thank you, Mr. Giles, and thank you, Bob Orr. That is a fantastic poem. Mr. Giles, we talked in an earlier video about going through poetry in different drafts, and on the first draft, we said no pens, just enjoy the ride, and then share some first impressions. What are your first impressions?
My first impressions are just this speaker and the relationship to a man that works in a tire shop. I just find that such an unusual relationship that he has with a man that he doesn't even know. And I think that's kind of interesting as he's observing and looking out his window.
Yeah, and for me, my first impression clearly was how the poem became more beautiful and more involved and more intricate as we got closer to the end. And I just felt like it was almost on that journey with the poet, watching him sort of struggle at the beginning and then find his voice. I just thought it was cool.
Yeah, it's kind of a poem about poetry.
Oh, meta poetry.
Yeah, I feel like it really is about the poetic process. Very interesting. And I want to dig into the poem in more detail. So we're going to get to that right now.
Let's do that. Okay, now that Mr. Giles has read the poem, I'd like to use spec films, apply it to the poem, and see what we can extract in terms of meaning. All right, of course the S stands for speaker and subject. And in line 2, we see the phrase, I'm sitting at my desk. And clearly that refers to the speaker, and we can see that that speaker is most likely a poet, a writer, and he's at his desk. And in line 5, we notice that the speaker is noticing things. He's looking around, and then while he's looking, he becomes intrigued in line 12 with the subject of the poem, which is the tire man. And as he's looking at the tire man, he notices in line 15 the struggle. And he notices that this man is struggling, much like he's struggling with his work as a writer. Okay? And then if we continue on through the poem, we see some changes happening, but I'll let my good friend Mr. Giles take those on the next part of spec films, which is the purpose.
Yeah, the purpose of the poem and the theme of the poem is that struggle to find inspiration and the writing process of writing poetry and where we can find inspiration. I think in line number 2, we see him saying that he's trying to tap into inspiration. This to me really captures the essence of the poem, is just trying to find the right words and to tap into what's going to inspire him to write that day as he wakes up in the morning. We see also in line number 7, he calls it like he's opening the doors like the first act of a play. Again, this sort of artistic creation as he's starting his day, just like the poet is starting to write this poem and kind of warm up to the day. We also see in line number 16 this idea of finding balance and balancing words, and we see all these sort of metaphorical lines that relate to the balancing of tires and comparing that to the balancing of words. And I feel like at the end of the poem, his dedication of this particular poem to his muse, which is the tire shop man, again connects to that purpose of finding inspiration and finding the beauty of writing this amazing poem.
Yeah, that's great. I think you really hit the purpose well, Mr. Giles. And I think moving on to the E of spec films, we get into the emotion. And when I get into the emotion, I think about tone and mood words, Mr. Giles. And I think when I look at line 6, we see the phrase, I guess you could say. To me, the speaker's lacking confidence in that part, Mr. Giles. I think that he's quite uncertain, and that the tone is clearly reflected that way in that part of the poem. I think in line 12, the speaker does become a bit more intrigued. We see the rhetorical question. I think the tone becomes much more inquisitive, sort of going through this observational period to a more inquisitive period, and he's being intrigued by the mysteries. As we move further through the poem in line 18, we see this phrase, but later. And I think this is a really important tone shift as well, Mr. Giles, because here's where the speaker is going to become more eloquent and more sophisticated with language. And I think the tone becomes much more confident. And that's reflected in the beauty of the writing. And then after going through this really beautiful section of poetry in lines 26 and 27, I think the tone and the emotion is very celebratory, where the speaker says, "Oh, stranger and neighbor, my accomplice, my mentor, and my muse." And then an exclamation mark at the end really shows the exalting, celebratory tone. So for me, those are the emotions that are carried out throughout the poem.
Okay, so the films, when we look at craft, we're going to start with a figurative language. I think I would start with talking about this entire poem as an extended metaphor, comparing the speaker writing poetry with the man in the tire shop who's balancing the tires, and the work in the shop of the tire shop being compared to the work of the poet. That's really important. We also see, when he compares the man rolling up the doors to the first act of a play in a simile. I talked a little bit about that, just being, again, the sort of opening of a drama, of a theater, and I thought that was really a significant simile. What else do you notice, Mr. Cohen?
Yeah, for me, I really appreciate that line talking about the black donuts. For the tire man, these black donuts represent the building blocks of his craft, and that equates metaphorically to the words that the author is using. Those are the building blocks of his craft. So the speaker is watching this tire man stack up his tools of his trade, and he's thinking about, how can I use the tools of my trade? Words, of course, words endure, and he's thinking about how can he do that?
Yeah, donuts and coffee. So it's kind of interesting. He also talks about, he compares that when you put them in the machines, they become like planets. They become the dark rings of invisible planets. I think that's a very rich metaphor to talk about. And it's almost like they become somewhat magical and mysterious, just like words do. They have this sort of magical power.
They do have a magical power, but they're difficult to use sometimes. And we see the tire shop man being compared to a bear, and he's lumbering around. And I think that's how the speaker feels. He's kind of lumbering around with his words, trying to find a way to use them, and he's struggling. It's tough.
And finally, we see this sort of comparison of the moon to a piece of crystal. We see this sort of beautiful, rich metaphors that are, again, show this sort of the significance and the beauty. Like a crystal is something precious. We could talk about the sort of beautiful metaphorical language there. Let's shift to I now.
Yeah, I, of course, is imagery. And, of course, there are many things to talk about, but for the sake of time, we'll try to be a bit brief. You know, for me, again, I really like those tires, and we can see the tires are stacked up, you know, before the black donuts. We have to visualize them stacked. So I think that really did a lot for me visually, Mr. Giles. How about you? Maybe another type
we picture what he pictures, and I think that's really important. Later in the poem, I see the sort of rich visual imagery of the sun subsiding through the trees at the back of my flat. Again, we're seeing this sort of beautiful sunset, and even the way it's described to break open the branches as the sun goes down. We see that it's breaking up the branches. That really creates a sort of vivid image.
That natural imagery of the sun, the moon, the wild orb, red. It's just really trees. We see nature really celebrated toward the end of the poem.
Yeah, that takes language.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of words that are underlined there that we might want to talk about.
Yeah, for me, when I look at the language, I notice at the beginning of the poem, it is the beginning. We see that in line 1, and we see lots of waiting and noticing, right? Those verbs are, he's in a passive state right now. The writer's not ready to write, just like the tire man's not ready to work.
Yeah, I love verbs, and you know, you think about the intrigue, his lumbering, the struggle. I think those words are really important. Towards the end of the poem,
Can I take it? I love it.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, I just love the end where he says, "My accomplice and my mentor." Is that what you're going to talk
Yeah.
about? Go for it. Take it.
No, you do it.
Yeah, I just love that this person's gone from almost a complete stranger to almost a comrade in arms. They're together, and he feels bonded to this man who he's probably never spoken to, but yet that person has become his inspiration. It's really cool. Accomplice, mentor, and muse. Really cool lexical cluster there at the end.
Yeah, and I feel like when we talk about the M and for music, I think we can actually talk about that mentor and muse and the alliteration of that and the significance of connecting those things and what he's saying about them. I didn't find the musical and the rhythm to be a very super significant part of this poem.
Well, that's interesting, Mr. Giles, because I think the poem is meant to highlight the struggle at the beginning, and it actually doesn't become musical at all toward the end when he sort of found his voice and found his inspiration.
I like that, and I think I agree with you.
Yeah, but I think structure, there is some interesting thing happening structurally. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I feel like we can almost take this poem into 3 sections. We have the beginning where he's just observing and he's looking and he's getting ready for the tire shop man to show up. And then the next part, the middle part of the poem, we see the tire shop man working, and we see like him balancing the tires. And then at the end of the poem is that sort of rich description of the sunset and what's happening there. I think that's really kind of structurally what's going on.
Yeah, you know, I think in the end, Mr. Giles, what we've tried to accomplish here today is to present to you a pretty difficult poem. This is a solid IB poem that you would encounter in literature or in Langlit, and this is something that I think would be worthy of assessment. It has enough complexity, and we really just wanted to show you how spec films can help you deconstruct a poem.
One last thing, I would just say, if you look, there's a link to the annotations that are much more detailed where you can see notes and things, and have a look at the annotations. I think that'll help kind of reinforce some of the things we talked about today.
Yeah, and last comment, in next video we will be writing about this poem, which is why we've gone through the lengthy description and deconstruction of the poem. So if you hang with us for another video, we'll show you how we use this video to produce a great piece of writing, okay? That's all for us for today. Once again, thank you for watching. We appreciate your viewership, and we really hope that we're having an impact in helping you become a better student in IB literature or IB Langlit. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.